I think it's about time to talk about the elephant in the room, and that's the future of player versus environment endgame in Guild Wars 2, and how seeing the bigger picture here makes everything make a bit more sense. It doesn't really soften the blow of recent and past developments much, but making sense is a good start. So first of all, let's take a look at history, and I'm keeping this video short, so this is a very condensed version. Every single form of endgame instance PvE Guild Wars 2 has ever seen has been created, had some form of problem, usually development problems or inaccessibility or lack of broad appeal, and has then been abandoned in favor of the next type of content on the chopping block. And in the current state of things, there is no consistent endgame PvE development in Guild Wars 2. Let me repeat that. In the current state of the game, endgame PvE is completely dead from a development perspective. Not a player perspective, players still love to play it, but from a development perspective, it is dead. And that's not hyperbole. You can just go and check the numbers. 500 days since the last Fractal, 600 days since the last Strike, and nearly 1,000 days since the last raid. If you don't think that's dead, then you're a lot more optimistic than even I am. So now that we're up to date with reality, what does this have to do with the recent removal of Mystic Coins from the reward table of Fractal Challenge modes and being added to Strikes instead? Well, just like before, it's important to consider broader context. A lot of players are accusing ArenaNet of not caring about the endgame scene, citing lack of development and changes such as the Mystic Coin removal, build templates not being well suited for hardcore players, poor balancing, the build swapping saga, and so on and on and on. I would say that this is a pretty valid way to feel about the past development of the game. And while we're being frank here, let's just get this on the table. ArenaNet has not done a very good job of handling any endgame mode. And by that, I mean PvP, World vs. World, or instance PvE content. So when you see players upset over a seemingly minor change, such as Mystic Coins being moved around and Clovers being less discounted, bear in mind that this is very much a straw breaking the camel's back from the perspective of players, heavily ingrained in the scene. I hope that makes the situation more relatable if you're confused as to why people care, or if you find it ridiculous players are quitting over this particular change, despite it not necessarily affecting gameplay directly. Players feel like they have been continuously disrespected despite being some of the most dedicated players in the game. That of course isn't the case. They are just not a large enough group to be financially relevant to the game's success, and as a result of that, it is understandable that ArenaNet is not really able to make decisions to particularly cater to these groups, as ultimately they are a business and need to dedicate resources accordingly. It doesn't help that the Mystic Coin change is fairly arbitrary. ArenaNet has even confirmed that less than 7% of all Mystic Coins come from Fractal Challenge modes, and that the Strikes will be introducing significantly more Mystic Coins overall, meaning that they aren't worried about too many Mystic Coins, they're worried about Fractals being too good compared to other content. But why would that be the case? Why would that be a concern? Well, I think it's quite simple, and this is where it all comes together. ArenaNet finally has a plan, and that plan is Strike missions, and they are going all in on them and giving them every possible advantage to succeed. Mystic Coins, difficulty settings, even legendary insights for the challenge modes. And this is where I think there is hope for the end game scene, despite what we've discussed so far in this video. Also, in my opinion, there is significant evidence that while ArenaNet haven't handled the endgame very well historically, they actually intend to really go for it with End of Dragons. We all know the core issue with content in Guild Wars 2 is that for whatever reason, they can't make it very fast, no matter what they seem to do. And as a result of that, pretty much everything in the game has to appeal to more or less every player, which makes the return on investment on hard content to be very low. This is the brutal inaccessibility problem of raids, and even the Icebrood Saga Strike content. They aren't too easy, which is a common misconception. They're actually far too hard for most players in the game. Fractals are also weird and require ascended gear and multiple progression systems attached to them, which is extremely out of place in Guild Wars 2, which I would imagine is a bit of a tough sell, as just starting to play that content will eventually require an expensive investment of sorts for a more casual player into an ascended set of armor and weapons. The End of Dragon Strikes, though, aim to solve these problems by being fully reused assets from the story with streamlined arenas instead of unique environments, and presumably 3 difficulty modes: Story, Normal, and Challenge. To reiterate this, End of Dragon Strike missions have design that solves all current problems in the PvE endgame. Reused assets so they can be developed alongside main story and still generate return on investment, very low barrier to entry, no ascended gear required, difficulty ramping across 3 levels so players of any skill level can enjoy the content. This of course also means that the challenge mode can be very challenging without alienating players and leading to a higher satisfaction compared to raids, which actually a lot of the very hardcore players find very easy. Hopefully a streamlined reward structure that will make sense to new and veteran players alike. For good measure, they even throw in the promise of actual uncheesable mechanics, but we'll see about that one. Just as a quick note here before we move on, it's important to say that this is just a description of what is possible with strikes, not necessarily what's going to happen on launch. In fact, it's very likely strikes will take a long time to reach their full potential, especially on the extreme difficulty end. But for the first time, the endgame PvE in Guild Wars 2 will actually have no fatal flaw built into its DNA, and I think that is absolutely a crucial fact to understand and worth getting excited about. Because of this, I think ArenaNet's plan is to go as hard as possible on strikes, to make sure they are appealing to players, especially in terms of rewards. Because, let's be honest here, players in MMOs are extremely reward driven, and if content is underwhelming reward-wise, well, you end up with players going back to the old content day 1 of the expansion, even if it's actually fun to play, which would obviously be a disaster. This is exactly what happened with Path of Fire on launch, with the open world content there, and still plagues certain events to this day, Serpent's Ire in particular. You could argue that nerfing fractal challenge modes isn't that relevant to making strike missions rewarding in their own right, and I think that's probably true, because the challenge modes were not super popular, and realistically players doing challenge mode are almost certainly going to play strikes anyway, because of how desperate everyone is for content. However, I think ArenaNet just really wanted to put strikes on a pedestal as the backbone of the endgame, which makes sense even if you don't agree with it, considering how hard ArenaNet seemed to be committing to strike missions. I don't think this actually suggests ArenaNet isn't confident in the content's ability to stand on its own either. They just want to remove as many possible points of failure as they can and guarantee that endgame players will consider it worth the effort to get into strikes over staying where they are. Additionally, fractals are still going to be pretty much the best daily liquid gold farm and gear farm in the game, and can be done alongside strikes without being replaced by them. On the topic of committing to strikes, we're even getting 4 strike missions on the launch of the expansion. This is unprecedented in the history of the game, and to me signals loud and clear that ArenaNet absolutely do care about the endgame scene in Guild Wars 2, and they want to use strike missions as the first step to attempting to find a consistent content plan, which to be honest we've never had in the game's history. Go back and check if you don't believe me. This game has never had a stable plan for endgame PvE that didn't fizzle out and die, despite ArenaNet's best efforts to prevent that from happening. If strike missions are a success and they're a more viable development option for ArenaNet and actually start to get players engaged with this concept of instant endgame PvE, then at that point they can start looking at making more raids and fractals more frequently or at all, maybe even applying the same design principles in strike missions to this content. Because right now, raids and fractals are brilliant content and you can see the love and care that went into crafting them, but they are simply not worth developing at a pace that we, the player base, want. And that reality is something that we need to understand and respect. We are in a position where we have essentially 2 options. Either accept that Guild Wars 2 will never have consistent endgame content, or get on board with strike missions and see how it plays out. I know that's a very tough sell to say, yeah, we'll have to just stick it out and at some point your game mode will hopefully get some love, but ultimately that is actually the best case scenario, because the alternative is repeating the past, which has led to one of the lowest trust and confidence relationships between a scene and the developers that I have ever seen in any game community. This is obviously a horrible option for both the players and the developers because, well, the veterans do tend to complain a lot and create a lot of negativity around the game, which is partially responsible for Guild Wars 2's poor reputation in the MMO scene, and in my opinion would eventually cause the already dwindling endgame scene to completely collapse, because contrary to popular belief, a lot of the endgame players who quit for Final Fantasy absolutely did not come back and they aren't coming back. The obvious criticism of my perspective here is that this is a false dichotomy. That is to say, I'm presenting two options when in reality there are more. However, I don't think this is really the case, because we've seen ArenaNet attempt to develop different types of niche player versus environment, and it hasn't really satisfied the community or been sustainable, which is why I do think that strikes are the best hope for endgame PvE. Similar principles could be applied to 5-player content, 5-player strikes, probably under a slightly different name is certainly possible, but with the resources available to ArenaNet, it is clear that a more streamlined and one-size-fits-as-many as possible approach is the best solution we've seen so far to the problems of endgame, and building it up to the point where it could actually be a more lucrative investment for the company. If what I've outlined here doesn't sound appealing to you as an endgame player, then that is 100% fair, and honestly I don't blame any world versus world endgame PvE or PvP player for quitting the game right now and taking a break. I did that when I wasn't enjoying the game, and it allowed me to totally shift my perspective and enjoy it in a different way, and accept Guild Wars 2 for what it is and what it's likely to be, not what I personally want it to be. We're in a very strange point in the game's history where it appears that legitimate fundamental change is happening. An engine upgrade to DirectX 11, which I certainly didn't expect to see happen. World vs. World Alliance is finally on the way. Regular balance patches, a release on Steam. Endgame content dropping on launch with a plan going forwards. Far superior communication. Willingness to change game design principles. And even an updated approach to marketing the game itself. Can I say that things are going to actually work out this time? No, I can't. But I think there has never been more evidence to suggest that we're actually in the redemption arc. The beginning of the arc, to be sure, and it's definitely going to be a bumpy ride, but for the first time in years, I can say that I'm actually seeing a bright future for endgame in Guild Wars 2 without even a shred of irony or sarcasm. These things take a long time, and it could very easily be a year or even more before things really get going. But like I've been saying all the time in this video, this is just the necessary process of rebuilding consumer trust in the endgame community without alienating the core audience of the game. I hope I expressed what I think is going on under the hood with Guild Wars 2 right now, and provided some perspective on the overall state of the game, not just in player versus environment, but the endgame as a whole. If you have any questions or want me to clarify something, please let me know, because this is an issue that I'm very passionate about, and I want us, the players, to get behind ArenaNet on their willingness to make drastic change, even if we don't agree with all of it. This game has been stuck in its ways for a long time, perhaps to the point where we're just used to it. So I think we should give ArenaNet a fair shot at this. I'm often quoted as saying every year is the year of Guild Wars 2, and this is a bit of a joke, as you might expect, but this time I'm dangerously close to actually being serious. Let's be constructive in our criticism and be sure to look at the bigger picture of what's happening in the game, community, and the future. Thanks for watching. Come and pester me on Twitch, leave an angry comment, and definitely subscribe and follow to all of my social media so we can continue the conversation and never break free from the grips of Guild Wars 2.